A waitress says to the Hells Angels, "Hi sir, my dad has a motorcycle just like yours." What? The fluorescent lights of the Sunrise Diner, a beacon of lukewarm coffee and lukewarm hope on the edge of Highway 17, hummed with their usual monotonous rhythm. Outside, the last vestiges of a bruised orange sunset bled into the dusty horizon, painting the sky in a fleeting display of beauty that few of the diner's weary patrons bothered to notice. Inside, the air hung heavy with the scent of stale grease, brewing coffee, and the faint, sweet decay of artificial air freshener. It was a Tuesday evening, typically slow, the kind of night where time seemed to stretch and warp, each minute feeling like an hour. Sarah, a young woman barely out of her teens, moved with practiced efficiency between the worn formica tables, a perpetual, tired smile plastered on her face. Her uniform, a pale blue button-up shirt and a dark apron, was impeccably clean, a small rebellion against the general dinginess of her surroundings. She was saving up for college, a dream that felt as distant and shimmering as the heat haze on the highway outside. Tonight, her biggest challenge had been convincing old Mr. Henderson that his decaf was, in fact, regular, a minor skirmish in the ongoing battle of diner life. Suddenly, the mundane quiet was shattered. A deep, guttural rumble, growing steadily louder, vibrated through the diner's plate glass windows, rattling the sugar dispensers and making the cutlery jingle in its bins. It wasn't just one engine, it was a symphony of raw power, a chorus of high-displacement V-twin motors roaring in unison. Heads turned, conversations died, and a palpable tension descended, thick and heavy as the diner's infamous gravy. Then they appeared. A phalanx of motorcycles, gleaming chrome and dark steel, pulled into the parking lot with an almost military precision. Harleys, every one of them, their custom paint jobs and modified exhausts announcing their presence with an undeniable authority. And astride them, figures cloaked in leather and denim, their backs adorned with the infamous death head patch. The Hells Angels. Not just one or two, but a full contingent, perhaps a dozen strong, dismounting with a casual, almost proprietorial air. The leader, a man whose grizzled beard seemed to have been carved from weathered oak and whose eyes held the weary wisdom of countless miles and untold stories, dismounted his road king with a fluid grace that belied his bulk. His cut, a sleeveless denim jacket, bore the Hells Angels logo prominently, along with an array of other patches signifying his chapter and rank. Tattoos snaked up his arms, disappearing under the sleeves of his black t-shirt. His companions, equally formidable, followed suit, their movements unhurried, their gaze sweeping the diner with an unsettling calmness. A hush fell over the diner, broken only by the continued low hum of the fluorescent lights. The other patrons, a mix of truckers, local families, and lonely travelers, suddenly found their food infinitely fascinating. No one met the biker's eyes. Sarah felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine, a sensation she'd only ever felt watching crime documentaries late at night. She'd heard stories, of course, everyone had. The Hells Angels were not just a motorcycle club, they were an institution, a force, and one that commanded respect, or at the very least, a wide berth. The group of bikers strode into the diner, their heavy boots thudding softly on the linoleum floor. The air seemed to grow heavier, charged with an unspoken energy. They took over the largest booth at the back, a semicircular monstrosity that usually accommodated a boisterous family of 6. Now, it was filled with silent, formidable men. Sarah instinctively knew that someone had to serve them. Her manager, a nervous man named Gary who usually barked orders, had suddenly developed an intense interest in restocking the napkin dispensers. Taking a deep breath, Sarah smoothed her apron and grabbed a pad and pen. It was her job. She couldn't just stand there. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the sudden, oppressive silence. As she approached their table, she tried to project an air of professional calm, a facade she hoped was convincing. The leader, the grizzled man, sat at the head of the booth, his eyes, surprisingly, not menacing, but rather observant, almost weary. He wasn't glaring, he was simply looking. "Can I get you gentlemen something to drink?" Sarah's voice, to her relief, didn't waver. It came out steady, albeit a little softer than usual. The leader's gaze flickered to her, then to his companions. A low murmur went through the group. "Coffee. Black." "All of us," he rumbled, his voice like gravel, but not unkind. And a menu. Sarah nodded, a tight smile on her face. Of course. I'll be right back with those. As she turned to head to the coffee machine, her mind raced. This was it. Just serve them, be polite, and they'd be gone. No trouble. Just do her job. She poured 12 cups of black coffee, her hands trembling slightly, the steam rising in delicate tendrils. She placed them on a large tray, along with a stack of menus, and made her way back to the booth. The other bikers watched her, their expressions unreadable, their faces a roadmap of hard living and sun-baked roads. She distributed the coffees and menus, trying to avoid eye contact, but also making sure she didn't appear rude or scared. As she placed the last cup in front of the leader, she noticed his motorcycle helmet resting on the seat beside him. It was a classic, open-face design, painted a deep, lustrous black, with a custom flame decal licking up its sides. It was a beautiful machine, and the helmet was clearly a treasured accessory. And then, a thought, innocent and utterly unbidden, popped into her head. A memory of her father, a mechanic by trade, tinkering with his own vintage Harley in the garage on weekends. A shared passion, she thought, a connection. She didn't think, she just spoke, her weary smile widening slightly, a genuine warmth breaking through her professional veneer. Hi sir, she began, her voice a little brighter now, my dad has a motorcycle just like yours. The words hung in the air, echoing in the sudden, profound silence that followed. The leader, who had been about to take a sip of his coffee, froze, his cup halfway to his lips. His eyes, which had been merely observant a moment ago, now narrowed, a faint, almost imperceptible shift in their depths. The murmuring among his companions ceased entirely. Every head at the table turned, not just to Sarah, but to the leader, their collective attention focusing on him, waiting. The air grew impossibly still, the diner's usual background hum suddenly deafening. Sarah, suddenly aware of the utter enormity of what she had just said, felt a cold dread seep into her bones. Her smile faltered, her heart now a frantic hummingbird trapped in her chest. She saw the subtle tightening of the leader's jaw, the slight clench of his hand around the coffee cup. The silence stretched, becoming an oppressive weight, pressing down on her, on every soul in the diner. She could feel the stares, not just from the bikers, but from every other patron, their fear and curiosity a tangible force. Her innocent attempt at connection had, it seemed, landed with the force of an unexploded bomb. The leader slowly lowered his coffee cup, placing it carefully on the table. His gaze, now intense and unblinking, fixed on her. The light in the diner seemed to dim, the background noise faded, and all that remained was the silent, expectant tension of a moment suspended, waiting for an answer, a reaction, a consequence. She swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry as sandpaper. She had no idea what she had just unleashed. The leader's eyes, hardened by years on the road and countless encounters, held Sarah's gaze in an unblinking stare. The silence stretched, becoming a physical entity, pressing down on everyone in the diner. Sarah felt a cold sweat prickle on her forehead, her earlier warmth replaced by an icy dread. Her innocent attempt at connection now felt like a grave error, a naive misstep into a territory she profoundly did not understand. She could feel the weight of every biker's eyes on her, and the stunned, fearful glances of the other patrons. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with the tangible presence of danger. Finally, the leader broke the silence, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of the diner. It wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable authority that silenced even the internal buzzing in Sarah's ears. My motorcycle, he said, his voice slow and deliberate, is not just like anyone else's. The words, though not overtly threatening, were laced with a chilling undertone. They were a statement of absolute ownership, of unique identity, and a subtle but firm correction that felt like a slap. Sarah's breath hitched. She tried to formulate an apology, a clarification, anything to diffuse the sudden, suffocating intensity of the moment, but her mind was a blank. Her tongue felt heavy and clumsy in her mouth. Another biker, a younger man with a shaved head and a prominent tattoo of a grim reaper on his neck, leaned forward from his seat, a sneer playing on his lips. You think you know about bikes, little girl? he challenged, his voice sharper, more openly hostile than the leader's. You think a Hell's Angels ride is just some toy your old man tinkers with? Sarah flinched, her gaze darting to the younger biker, then back to the leader, whose eyes remained fixed on her, unreadable. She felt a desperate need to explain, to backtrack, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. No, sir, I didn't mean. I just meant the model, the make, a Harley, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper, her professional veneer completely shattered. My dad has an old Road King, too, from the 70s. He loves it. A faint, almost imperceptible flicker crossed the leader's eyes at the mention of Road King. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same steely gaze. The younger biker scoffed, leaning back. 70s? That's a classic, sure. But not just like this. He gestured dismissively towards the leader's helmet on the seat, then towards the parking lot where their machines gleamed under the dying light. The leader raised a hand, a subtle gesture that immediately silenced the younger man. He continued to study Sarah, a thoughtful, almost evaluating expression on his face. The silence returned, just as heavy, just as fraught with tension. Sarah felt exposed, vulnerable, every nerve ending screaming at her to flee, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. Her gaze fell to the leader's hands, resting on the table. They were large, calloused, the knuckles scarred, hands that had seen hard work, hard living, and perhaps harder actions. What's your name, waitress? The leader asked, his voice still low, but now devoid of any discernible emotion. Sarah, sir, she managed, her voice still trembling. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. Sarah. You think you know what a motorcycle means to a man like me? It wasn't a question seeking an answer, but a rhetorical challenge, a probe into her understanding, or lack thereof. Sarah had no response. What could she say? That it was freedom? Brotherhood? A way of life? She knew these things intellectually, from movies and documentaries, but she knew nothing of the reality, of the deep, often dangerous commitment these men embodied. Across the diner, Gary, the manager, was still pretending to be engrossed in the napkin dispenser, but Sarah could feel his terrified gaze periodically flicking towards their table. He was no help. She was on her own. The leader took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes still on her over the rim of the cup. The simple act felt deliberate, almost theatrical, prolonging the agonizing suspense. When he lowered the cup, he wiped a stray drop from his beard with the back of his hand. A motorcycle, Sarah, he began, his voice taking on a different timbre now, a narrative quality, is more than just metal and rubber. For us, it's our skin. Our blood. It's the road beneath us, the wind in our faces, the roar in our ears. It's every mile we've ridden, every brother we've stood with, every challenge we've faced. He paused, his gaze sweeping over his companions, who listened with an almost reverent attention. It's our freedom. Our family. Our identity. He turned back to Sarah, his eyes piercing. So when you say your father's motorcycle is just like mine, you're not just talking about the make and model. You're talking about everything that comes with it. And unless your father is a patched member of the Hells Angels, riding with us, living our life, then no, his motorcycle is not just like mine. The weight of his words settled upon Sarah, heavy and undeniable. She understood now, with a sickening clarity, the depth of her misstep. It wasn't just a casual remark, it was an unwitting trespass onto sacred ground, a trivialization of something profoundly significant to these men. She had inadvertently diminished their identity, their very essence, by a careless comparison. I apologize, sir, Sarah said, her voice barely audible, filled with genuine remorse. I truly didn't mean to offend. I understand now. It was a thoughtless comment. The leader watched her, his expression a complex mix of appraisal and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. He leaned back in the booth, his gaze still intense. The other bikers remained silent, their eyes on their leader, waiting for his cue. The air in the diner remained thick, charged with the lingering tension. Thoughtless, the leader repeated, the word hanging in the air. He took another sip of coffee. Sometimes, thoughtless comments can have consequences, Sarah. Sarah's heart pounded. This was it. What kind of consequences? Was she going to lose her job? Was it something worse? Her mind raced through every dark story she'd ever heard about motorcycle clubs, her imagination painting grim scenarios. She swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. What do you know about consequences, Sarah? Another biker, older than the Grim Reaper tattoo guy, with a long gray ponytail and a weathered face, asked from the other end of the booth. His voice was calmer, less aggressive, but equally firm. You live in a world where things are easy. Where a mistake is just a mistake. We don't. The leader held up his hand again, silencing the older biker. He seemed to be conducting a silent orchestra of intimidation, each gesture, each word, carefully measured. Your father's a mechanic, you said, he asked, abruptly shifting the topic. Sarah, startled by the sudden change, nodded quickly. Yes, sir. He runs a small garage a few towns over. Mostly cars, but he loves working on old Harleys in his spare time. A faint, almost imperceptible nod from the leader. He seemed to be processing this information, weighing it. The intensity of his gaze softened ever so slightly, or perhaps it was just Sarah's desperate hope that made it seem so. And you, he continued, you're working here to save for college. Again, Sarah nodded, surprised that he remembered, or perhaps had deduced. Yes, sir. To study nursing. A low murmur went through the group of bikers, a collective hum of assessment. The leader's eyes, however, remained fixed on Sarah, a thoughtful expression now dominating his features. He seemed to be seeing her not just as a waitress who had made a gaffe, but as a person, with a life, with aspirations. This felt almost more unsettling than the earlier intimidation. It was a different kind of scrutiny. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. Nursing, huh? That takes a certain kind of person. A person who cares. A person who can handle tough situations. His gaze was still piercing, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes now, a challenge, perhaps, or a test. You think you can handle tough situations, Sarah? The question hung in the air, a loaded proposition. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline. This wasn't about the motorcycle anymore, not directly. It was about her character, her resilience. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. I try my best, sir, she replied, her voice gaining a little more strength, a little more conviction. I believe I can. The leader watched her for another long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, a slow, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his lips, a flicker of something that might have been amusement, or perhaps even respect. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. All right, Sarah, he finally said, his voice returning to its low, gravelly tone, but now carrying a different weight. Tell us about this menu. What's good tonight? Sarah blinked, utterly taken aback. The abrupt shift, the sudden change in tone, left her reeling. She had been braced for a lecture, a threat, perhaps even a demand for some form of penance. Instead, he was asking about the specials. It was an unexpected reprieve, a sudden lifting of the oppressive tension, but it also felt like a test she hadn't realized she was still taking. The other bikers, too, seemed to relax slightly, a collective exhale that had been held for minutes. She fumbled with the menu in her hand, her mind still racing, trying to process the rapid turn of events. Well, sir, the meatloaf special is usually quite popular. Comes with mashed potatoes and green beans. Or we have the chicken fried steak, also with mashed potatoes and gravy. She rattled off the options, her voice still a little shaky, but gaining confidence as she focused on the familiar task. The leader listened, his eyes occasionally flicking to the menu, then back to her. He seemed to be observing her recovery, her return to her professional role. It was clear that the incident hadn't been forgotten, merely put aside, perhaps to be revisited, perhaps not. The air was still charged, but the immediate threat had receded, replaced by a lingering sense of uncertainty. Meatloaf, the leader announced, his voice firm. All of us. And more coffee. Sarah nodded, relief washing over her in a dizzying wave. "Right away, sir." She turned, eager to escape the intense scrutiny, to gather her thoughts and calm her nerves. As she walked away, she could feel their eyes on her back, a physical sensation that made her shoulders tense. She had averted a crisis, it seemed, but she had also stepped into a world far more complex and dangerous than she had ever imagined. The conversation about the motorcycle, about her father, about her aspirations, it had all been a test, a deliberate probing of her character. And she had, somehow, passed. For now. But the memory of that chilling silence, the leader's piercing gaze, and the unspoken weight of their presence would stay with her, a stark reminder of the thin line she had walked. The diner, usually a place of monotonous routine, now felt like a crucible, and she, Sarah, the young waitress saving for college, was suddenly playing a part in a much larger, unspoken drama. The plates clattered softly in the kitchen, the fluorescent lights hummed, and the smell of stale grease mingled with the promise of meatloaf, but nothing felt the same. Her shift had just begun, and the real education, she realized, was only just starting. Sarah, still reeling from the unexpected shift in the conversation, nodded briskly, turning towards the kitchen. Her legs felt a little wobbly, but a surge of adrenaline propelled her forward. She could feel the collective gaze of the bikers on her back, a physical weight that made her shoulders tense. The kitchen, usually a noisy, chaotic space, felt like a sanctuary. She relayed the order to old Gus, the cook, who merely grunted in response, his back to her, already slamming pans on the stove. As she waited for the food, Sarah leaned against the stainless steel counter, taking deep, shaky breaths. The tension, though momentarily diffused, still clung to her like the scent of old frying oil. She replayed the conversation in her head, the leader's gravelly voice echoing his words about identity, freedom, and family. She understood now. Her casual remark had been a profound disrespect, an unwitting insult to men for whom their motorcycles were not just vehicles, but extensions of their very being. The incident had been a stark, immediate lesson in the weight of words and the unseen depths of other people's worlds. When Gus finally slid 12 plates of steaming meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans across the pass, Sarah took another fortifying breath. The aroma was comforting, familiar, a small anchor in the storm of her emotions. She loaded the plates onto 2 large trays, her hands steady now, a new resolve hardening her gaze. She was a waitress. This was her job. She would do it, and she would do it well. Returning to the booth, she moved with renewed purpose. The bikers were talking amongst themselves in low tones, their voices a continuous rumble that didn't quite reach her ears. As she placed the plates before them, each man nodded a silent acknowledgement, their eyes, though still intense, held a different quality now, less scrutinizing, more accepting. The leader watched her, a faint, unreadable expression on his weathered face. He picked up his fork, speared a piece of meatloaf, and took a bite. A slow, almost imperceptible nod followed. "Good," he grunted, a single word that carried more weight than any elaborate compliment. Sarah managed a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, sir." The rest of the meal passed in a relative quiet, punctuated by the clinking of cutlery and occasional low remarks between the bikers. They ate with an efficient, no-nonsense air, clearly accustomed to fueling up on the road. Sarah refilled their coffee cups several times, always met with a quiet nod or a brief, direct gaze. She observed them more closely now, no longer paralyzed by fear, but with a newfound curiosity. They weren't the caricatures she'd seen in movies, nor were they simply menacing figures. They were men, hardened by life, bound by a code, and intensely protective of their identity. She saw the camaraderie in their glances, the unspoken understanding that passed between them. It was a different kind of family, forged not by blood, but by shared experiences and a common path. As the last plate was cleared, the leader caught her eye. "Check, Sarah," he said, his voice flat but not unkind. Sarah retrieved the bill, her heart once again giving a little flutter. This was the final act, the moment of reckoning. She placed the check on the table in front of him. He glanced at it, then reached into his leather vest, pulling out a thick wad of bills. He peeled off several, placing them on the table, far more than the total. Then, He took a pen from his pocket, scribbled something on the back of the receipt, and pushed it towards her. "Keep the change," he said, his eyes holding hers. "And remember what I told you." Sarah looked down at the receipt. On the back, in a surprisingly neat, strong hand, he had written, "Respect isn't given, it's earned. And a good nurse knows how to listen, even when it hurts." Below it, a scrawled signature read. Her breath hitched. The words were a parting lesson, a final, unexpected piece of wisdom. It was an acknowledgement of her apology, a recognition of her aspiration, and a poignant reminder of the tension they had just navigated. It was a testament to the fact that he had seen her, truly seen her, beyond the uniform and the initial gaffe. "Thank you, Red," Sarah said, the name feeling natural on her tongue, her voice filled with a genuine, heartfelt gratitude. He gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a final, unreadable flicker in his eyes. Then, with a collective scrape of chairs, the Hells Angels rose. Their departure was as precise and coordinated as their arrival. They moved through the diner, their heavy boots thudding softly, their presence still commanding, but now without the oppressive weight of initial tension. The other patrons, who had remained frozen in their seats, watched them go, a collective sigh of relief rippling through the room as the last leather-clad back disappeared out the door. The rumble of their engines, once again a powerful symphony, filled the night air, growing fainter as they rode off into the darkness, leaving behind only the lingering scent of exhaust fumes and an absence that felt almost as palpable as their presence. Sarah stood by the booth, clutching the receipt in her hand, the words, "Respect isn't given, it's earned," burning themselves into her mind. She looked at the generous pile of cash left on the table, enough to cover several shifts, a substantial boost for her college fund. It wasn't just a tip, it was a gesture, a recognition, a tangible sign that she had, indeed, passed the test. Gary, the manager, finally emerged from his self-imposed exile behind the napkin dispensers, his face pale, his eyes wide. They're gone," he stammered, his voice thin with relief. Sarah turned to him, a newfound strength in her posture. "Yes, Gary. They're gone." He looked at her, then at the money, then back at her, a mixture of awe and bewilderment on his face. "Sarah, what happened?" She gave him a small, knowing smile. "I just did my job, Gary. And I learned a little about respect." She picked up the money, folded the receipt carefully, and tucked it into her apron pocket. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. The diner slowly returned to its usual monotonous rhythm, but for Sarah, nothing was truly the same. The fluorescent lights still hummed, the coffee still brewed, but the air felt charged with a different kind of energy. The memory of the Hells Angels, their leader Red, and the unexpected lesson they had imparted, became a permanent fixture in her mind. As she finally punched out, the night air cool on her face, Sarah walked to her car, the receipt still clutched in her hand. She thought about her father, about his old road king, and about the unspoken language of the road. She thought about nursing school, about the complex, often difficult people she would encounter, and about the need to truly listen, to understand the hidden depths of their stories. The encounter had been terrifying, enlightening, and ultimately, empowering. It had shown her that the world was far larger and more nuanced than she had ever imagined, filled with people who lived by different rules, held different values, and for whom an innocent remark could carry profound weight. She had faced down an intimidating force, not with defiance, but with professionalism, humility, and a willingness to learn. Sarah knew that the path to becoming a nurse, to achieving her dream, would be filled with many challenges, many tough situations. But tonight, in the humble setting of the Sunrise Diner, she had taken a crucial step. She had learned the value of respect, the power of words, and the quiet strength of empathy. The experience had forged something new within her, a quiet confidence, a deeper understanding of the human condition. Her college fund was a little fuller, but her spirit was even richer. The hum of the highway, usually a sound of endless monotony, now held a faint echo of roaring engines, a reminder of the night she had truly begun to see the world, and herself, anew.